Good evening, YouTube. Good evening, my fellow Canadians. This will be an analysis of a interview that occurred here on BNN Bloomberg about Bill C-69. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy the analysis.
Canada's environmental policies have been at the forefront of some of the country's most controversial economic debates, and tomorrow's expected Senator report on Bill C-69 could set the precedent for what happens next. Here to discuss what is at stake for the energy sector, as well as other sectors across Canada, and alongside, of course, protecting the environment, is Brett Wilson, chairman at Canoe Financial. Joining us from Ottawa is Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party of Canada, and also in Ottawa, Josh Ginsberg, lawyer at Eco Justice. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much to everyone for being part of this conversation. We've got a lot of different views here, which we want to get to everybody and everything. But Brett, let me just start with you. I want our viewers to really understand what Bill C-69 is, just real brief, and why you are so against it as it relates to the energy industry and perhaps what it will do to the lack of pipelines being built.
Well, the proponents of 69, Bill 69 and Bill C-48, you can't ignore one without the other, are well-intended in the thought that we're going to be more efficient in the development of our infrastructure, which will allow us to bring our resources to market. Unfortunately, as it's structured, again, nothing to do with intent, but as it's structured, it fails. It will landlock. We're already having enough trouble getting proper approvals put through. We've already got approvals for pipelines that are being blocked by people at various levels. So either democracy works or it doesn't, but the thought that we're going to block Canada from participating in the global economy is what we're basically doing with C-48. No tanker ban anywhere else in the world. We allow oil to come in. We're making no effort to block the oil transported along our coast or into our country. No effort whatsoever. So that's where the hypocrisy and the disingenuous approach that's being taken by those who are proponents fails.
Josh, let me have you respond to Brett's comments, because when Brett is talking about the blocking of these pipelines, part of the reason behind Bill C-69 is to potentially help projects get built, because supposedly, according to the Liberal proposal, they won't get blocked in the court system.
Well, yes, and let me give the background here that this bill exists in, which is that Canada and indeed the world are facing a twin set of emergencies. There's the climate emergency, which we know we've got just a little more than a decade to take action on, or we're going to be locked in to the very worst effects of climate change. And then we have the biodiversity emergency, which is that we are losing species and ecosystem diversity at a very alarming rate. So we need to get on top of this, and we have not been, partly because we've not had a good system of evaluating the impacts of the biggest projects that do cause a lot of these problems. So Bill C-69 is a better way to have these conversations and actually puts on the table a list of issues that are relevant to having those conversations. Industry players, and I have to say particularly the oil and gas industry, are ringing a false alarm here about the supposed damage that this bill is going to cause. In fact, it is a very modest and incremental improvement on the system we have now, which everybody agrees isn't working. So this system does a few very subtle and important things to make sure we're having better conversations and are taking into account important things in the face of two real crises.
Elizabeth, let me have you weigh in on this, because you said this is getting debated right now in Ottawa. And in terms of just a few minor tweaks that Josh referred to, when I take a look at it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but within mining, as an example, there are at least 10 thresholds that have been increased in terms of increasing difficulty or higher tests, a higher bar in terms of getting projects approved. 10. That doesn't seem like just a few.
Well, the Mining Association of Canada, just to use mining as a sector, was significantly disadvantaged when Stephen Harper's government repealed the Environmental Assessment Act we'd had since Brian Mulroney moved it forward. I'm actually not a fan of C-69. I think that it puts in concrete a very weakened approach to environmental assessment, which will mean that the federal government abdicates its responsibility to ensure that it assesses any project that involves federal jurisdiction. the whole tilt has gone far too much towards we're only going to look at the big projects. I think it violates the election promises the Liberals made to repair the damage that Harper did to our environmental laws. But just to back up and say, this is primarily and should be primarily a bill about making sure the federal government does its homework. Nixon brought in such a law in the U.S. in his administration, and at that point Canada adopted an approach through order in council. It wasn't legislated. But since 1976, the federal government had always reviewed projects if it was within federal jurisdiction, small and large projects. No project was ever turned down until Stephen Harper's government came in, and then they repealed the whole scheme of the legislation. Unfortunately, C-69 is, I think, so inadequate that I voted against it. But the hysteria on the side of the oil and gas sector, I agree with Josh, it's completely wrong to say this is an anti-pipeline bill. It could just as easily be a pro-pipeline bill because it's so flawed that it allows ministerial discretion at many points without a thorough evaluation. And it certainly means that thousands of projects within federal jurisdiction will never be evaluated, but will continue to have these conflicts over pipelines.
Brett, how do you respond to this?
Go
ahead, Josh.
Let me jump in and say, if I can, thank you, that I absolutely agree with Elizabeth. This is not the bill that the environmental community wanted. This is not the fundamental reform of environmental assessment that we think this country really needs. What it was a compromise, a very delicate compromise between environmental interests and other interests. And yes, we say the bill absolutely does not go far enough, but it does do a few really important things in my view. And one is that it brings issues to the forefront at an early planning stage. And this is something that proponents do now, but they do it in an informal way that doesn't necessarily influence the process. This brings the government to the table and the proponent and stakeholders at the very earliest stage of the project to talk about what's really at issue here. What are going to be the things that we really have to debate and we can't move on to discuss without. Ironing out some of the problems that really tie up these things in protests and indeed in litigation. So that's really important. The second thing is that it actually articulates a list of factors that have to be taken into consideration so we don't have to fight about each and every project, what's relevant, what isn't relevant. That's really important. It creates space for regional and strategic assessments, so high-level policy discussions that are going to inform the project-level assessments. That's something that's never been done before, certainly not on a scale that's had any impact.
Doesn't it also, let me ask, because this is important, doesn't it also, in its original form, give the environment minister the ultimate power of delaying projects indefinitely?
And that's where we suffer
so let me
in terms
ask,
of, as a nation, when we allow that sort of discretion to step in. And many of the comments made by our colleagues on this panel talk about sort of the pro-environment. We have to protect the environment, which is another way of saying we're anti-pipelines. We will not allow incremental production from the oil sands. We will not allow any tankers to be shipped. Go back to Bill C-48. And yet globally, we've gone in the last decade from 95 million barrels a day of production to over 100. So the economy globally for energy is growing. We've not stopped a single barrel from being produced. The hypocrisy of the efforts that are being made to landlock Alberta, and it's been stated, many groups, EcoJustice, Lead Now, Change.org, many have said, Dogwood, have said, we want to landlock the Alberta oil industry as an example to the world. But in the meantime, the world continues to grow. So we need a process that allows us to be efficient. We have the most regulated and thoughtful energy industry in the world. If the world was to produce at the same greenhouse gas intensity that we do, we'd be down by 23% tomorrow. So instead of worrying so much about what Canada's doing to participate in the global economy, why aren't any of these groups using genuine efforts to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a global basis? No effort whatsoever outside of Canada. So, that's the hypocrisy.
And why is that the case, Josh?
Okay, so there's quite a lot of data that went through there, and I apologize if it's been a little bit long, but there are a lot of issues, so let's get to it. Obviously, Brett Wilson is the one that I agree with here in this scenario. Elizabeth May strikes me as a very dangerous individual for Canada. She would be what I classify as an environmental radical. And you can appreciate that if you want, but if you don't, it is what it is. Essentially, during the debate, her policies scare me. She would return this country to the Stone Age. I can vouch for that. If you look at her policies, when what she desires to implement, I don't know if she would see the pipelines and the oil sands disappear. That's her idea. That's her solve for the problem. So we won't get too much into it, except that she does blame Harper for a lot of the environmental, let's call them redactions in bills that Harper passed. And the reason that Harper redacted it, or pardon me, well, you could say reduced the bill or altered its effects, the environmental bills, I mean, because Stephen Harper didn't want to see Alberta fail. Stephen Harper understood the need for Alberta to function properly and its power source as the country's engine for the economy. Essentially, you could say it like that. I mean, we have many other economies that are occurring in Canada, but the oil and gas, that the energy sector is undoubtedly a major contributor to the GDP and the growth of this country, without a doubt. So we'll get into it. In addition, May finds C-69 to be inadequate, and she actually thinks it's a pro-pipeline bill, which is absolutely... if that doesn't show you she's a radical environmentalist, I just don't know what is. C-69 will undoubtedly prevent energy sector projects from occurring without first government discretion, especially the environmental minister, Catherine McKenna, having her claws into it, so to speak. And at full discretion, you will have to get their approval. As I understand it from Josh, there will be a lot more debate occurring, which will cause more delays. And I mean, everything goes through the environmental minister's office. It's as Brett put it, it is a tremendous amount of power for one politician, for one minister to carry that kind of tremendous responsibility. So if in fact it will be implemented, now that, well, I believe it's already implemented, but Trudeau will be Prime Minister for the next 4 years, so let's assume that this is not the end. This is just the beginning of what will be the end of the oil sands in Canada. But there's a few other points I want to bring up about Josh. First of all, he thinks of C-69 as addressing the twin climate emergency. So if you look at it like that, he's one of those people that is subscribing to fear-mongering and inspiration of fear by to create action, similar to Greta Thunberg's approach. So fear-mongering amongst the people. We only have 10 years before we make irrevocable damage to the climate, and so on and so on and so forth. They're using fear tactics essentially to inspire their followers into action. So getting back to Brett has the approach I like the best, which is the hypocrisy is in the details. They're attacking, the environmental radicalists are attacking Canada itself, but they're doing nothing for oil that's imported, say, from Saudi Arabia, from the Middle East, pipelines that are passing through, the country itself. The environmental radicalists don't condemn China or India for their extreme pollution and whatnot, their extreme carbon footprint, if you will, like the Chinese especially. I heard a long time ago that they're producing something like 300 coal-fired plants a year. I have no doubt that's increased. And if I'll make another video and I'll try to find out exactly how many more it's increased. But you can say that lifting out 700 million people out of poverty will do that. And they have to get the energy from somewhere. Hydroelectric was never adequate enough to produce that kind of power. Nuclear power would be, but coal is the easiest and the cheapest and the fastest to build, so that's what they're building. In addition to the high difficulty of projects to get approved, and so on in this country after 69 is implemented, and of course C-48, as Brett put, C-48 is just as important. The tankers, essentially our oil being landlocked because the tankers can't get it out. We can't make use of the sea routes. And I think one of the citation for that was that it was affecting whale populations. As I understand it, not a single whale population, not a single pod has been affected by tanker traffic. Correct me if I'm wrong. It could be. Essentially, as I understand it, the radar system, the sonar systems in those tankers are extremely sophisticated. So if they hit, I think they have more than ample warning before they can hit any object. And I mean, if they can detect a little fishing boat, they can detect a whale, no problem. So it's like, that was the pretense to implement C-48, I think one of them. But as if you scrutinize it further, you'll find that there's no basis for that. It was extremely political, a political decision. So what Brett is saying, if the rest of the world were to come to the parameters that Canada follows and the extreme regulation and energy that we follow, I believe he said pollution would drop by about 23%. So that shows just how responsible and regulated and clean our approach to the energy sector is. A 23, it doesn't sound like much, but it's a tremendous, a massive amount. It's a massive amount. And I think I've gone on a little bit too long here, so I will make a second video on this interview. I thank you for your time and attention, and thank you for bearing with me. Goodbye.